Hey guys, and welcome to episode 8 of the Limit Breakers podcast. This episode in particular has been a long time coming. We want to sincerely apologize to you guys for that. A number of things came up between the original recording of the episode and now, but we're glad that it's finally done and it's ready to be released for everybody to listen to. Bear with us if you would with this episode as far as the audio, because we're getting used to a new editing setup and some new settings, so things are sort of in flux, but we still hope you really enjoy it. All that said, this episode features Final Fantasy Tactics, and the episode originally had a wonderful, eloquent, spirited intro by Steve, which I reference later in the episode. Unfortunately, that audio was too screwy to be used in the end, so you're stuck with this new one instead. But as you'll hear in the episode, Tactics is a game that we have very strong opinions and ties to. So sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 8 of the Limit Breakers podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Limit Breakers podcast. After that great introduction by Steve, we are back here on 4th of July weekend. Good weekend to kick back, relax, play some games if you're in the mood, or, cook out whatever you're feeling. As Steve mentioned, we're talking about one of our favorite all-time games today, which is Final Fantasy Tactics. And we have a special guest here with us to talk about that game. He's someone you've already been introduced to after our Dota episode. His name is Andrew. What's going on, Andrew?
What's going on, guys?
I think the reception was pretty good to our banter about MMOs, and this will be a slightly different thing because we won't be talking about, necessarily how hard we've owned or gotten owned in an online capacity, but we have a pretty elaborate history with Andrew when it comes to tactics, so I think he'll be a really good guest. But I'm also joined, obviously, with Steve. What's going on, Steve?
Hey, what's up, Kim?
It has been a good weekend so far. As we usually do, we like to talk about the games we've been playing, and I think I can speak for us all when I say we've played a fair bit of Overwatch recently. There is other stuff that I think we do want to touch on as far as our recent gaming past, but as far as Overwatch goes, how are you guys enjoying it?
It's been awesome. Intense games, quick games, which is good. So if you want to grab a couple games and then get out, it's good. You're not going to be stuck there for a couple hours.
I think now that competitive mode has been released, it's definitely been a different vibe of game for me. It's much more intense and at times frustrating, but also just the sense of achievement is so much greater now, even with the rather short game lengths, that I think it's a wonderful game.
I know in reality, at least Justin, the reason he gave us for not being here today is because he's not the biggest of Final Fantasy Tactics fans, but I kind of also think that some of our comments to him while playing Overwatch might have inspired his absence today. I know he was unofficially banned from playing about 15 of the heroes in the game so far, so I don't know if that tied directly into him skipping this episode, but I'd like to think deep down that it did. But yeah, on the whole, I think we've all really enjoyed it. I know I personally haven't gotten into the competitive play yet because I was waiting for all of us to be able to do it together, but I'm equally nervous and excited about getting into that because I feel like, given some of the games we've already had just in quick play, I think competitive's going to be pretty interesting. But maybe before we talk about other things we've been playing, I know one thing we were just talking about before the episode, we actually saw the Warcraft movie, or at least Andrew and I did recently, and I know that was something that, especially coming off our storytelling episode, I was really kind of interested in how I would perceive it given all the reviews I had heard, and I don't want to speak for Andrew, I'll let him give his own little short review, but it was kind of exactly as I expected in both a good and bad way. It was a really cool depiction of the world of Warcraft and really awesome to see those games brought to life in such a big budget, really great looking way. But it also did sort of have a lot of the trappings of video game movies. The acting was sort of either wooden or just not that memorable. The writing was sort of inferior to the setting and the overall plot. A lot of the stuff was hard to follow if you didn't know the games well. So I'm really glad I saw it. I really did enjoy it, and I would recommend it to any fan of Warcraft, but it's certainly not a cinematic masterpiece that you're going to really regret missing out on. Did you enjoy it overall, Andrew? Or?
Yeah, I think for what it was worth, what they were aiming for, I think they nailed it. As far, like you said, as far as the acting goes, it was bland. The writing was boring too. But as far as an action movie, with griffins and orcs and whatnot, it was really cool. Especially seeing like a polymorph on screen was actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I think the polymorph and the griffin destroying like 60 orcs by itself was like two of the most commented on scenes in the movie online. And I think it was pretty heavy-handed how much they were setting up for sequels. So with the success of the movie overseas, I wouldn't be that surprised if there are sequels. But I mean, it's the kind of movie where I think if they came out, I'd see them, but I wouldn't be devastated if they didn't make them. It's sort of just a lukewarm thing, but I'm still definitely glad that it was made.
Yeah, and just to add along with that, I guess they had to explain so much in the first movie with storylines and character development that it maybe took away from the writing a little bit.
That's true. It's a very dense world and very dense game background, so to try to fit all that in while also making people happy in like an action sense is tough.
Yeah.
I know, Steve, you didn't see it. You were mentioning you had sort of mixed feelings about it too, but what have you been playing in the stead of seeing Warcraft?
Well, certainly I've been playing a great deal of Overwatch, as we mentioned, but now and then even I need some downtime from Overwatch, because of just at this point really just the level of, again, as I mentioned, the level of intensity of the games. And what I have been playing in my downtime has primarily been Divinity: Original Sin, the Enhanced Edition. I think today is actually, well, it'll be too late for the people listening, but I think today is literally the last day of Steam's summer sale where you can get it for like $20, which is extraordinary. But yeah, fantastic game that I'm playing through for the second time, but the first time, of course, through the Enhanced Edition that I've been enjoying immensely, and I hope one day you guys will actually join me on that train. Other than that, I've also been looking into getting XCOM 2, reading many of the reviews and watching many of the videos, as I enjoyed XCOM 1 immensely as well.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people talking about that. That's something based on your recommendation and other people's recommendations that I've thought about myself, but I'm actually in a position I've been in quite often recently, which is acquiring an increasing number of games without actually playing almost any of them. So it's like a growing library that I do intend to get to at some point, but actually haven't quite worked through yet, especially because after I got a new 3DS and a PSP, I went kind of nuts and got like every game I'd ever wanted for either system, but I've beaten maybe like one of the 20 or so I've gotten so far. I got Final Fantasies 1 through 4, I got Crisis Core, I got Tactics Ogre, which I've been playing, Breath of Fire 3, Metroid Prime for GameCube, Radiant Historia, and Bravely Second for 3D. You know, just a treasure trove of backlogged games, but like you mentioned, Overwatch has been the primary thing I've been playing, so I do intend to get into all that at some point, but it is kind of funny to look at the shelf and see like 15 unopened games just staring back at you.
I do want to mention one further thing for those who are listening who are fans of Divinity Enhanced Edition, because I know that it has quite a few followers. One thing I've been significantly enjoying lately that I recently posted on Reddit about was actually a character build called the Glass Cannon Tank, which sounds like a joke, but actually Glass Cannon normally makes a character much weaker, but if you equip a tank with essentially a very powerful shield, zombie ability, very high elemental resistances, and of course, a dagger, so you can have access to both man-at-arms and scoundrel line. It's an extraordinary character build with very high utility that's made my playing the game immensely fun. I like to think that I thought of it first, so look into that.
I think Steve's commentary there on a class-based, skill-based, really customizable system is going to segue really well into a discussion of Final Fantasy Tactics, but anything else you want to mention gaming-wise before we get into it, Andrew? Are you ready to roll?
Yeah, just same stuff. Overwatch, Dota 2.
I gotcha. So yeah, Steve, I think that segue was pretty much perfect because I know a huge element of what we want to talk about in regards to Final Fantasy Tactics is how the complexity and depth of the game allowed for a really fun game that could be played really casually, but also allow for a ton of customization, a ton of replayability, a ton of different things to try out. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of what made Final Fantasy Tactics so great in our opinion, let's talk a little bit about maybe our first memories of the game, how we either discovered it, what we first thought of it. You know, I know in my own personal case, it's kind of funny because in doing like a mini bit of research for this episode, I didn't actually like remember or realize recently that it had come out so soon after Final Fantasy VII. I knew it was the next thing that came out, and I knew it wasn't that long after, but I didn't know that its North American release was only 4 months later, which is pretty crazy for any game series, but especially for one as big as Final Fantasy. But I remember just getting over the high of playing Final Fantasy VII, which was my favorite gaming experience of all time at the time and remains my favorite game of all time today. And, you know, after completely falling in love with that, anything I saw at any game store or Blockbuster that said Final Fantasy, I just grabbed immediately and was like all about. So when I brought Final Fantasy Tactics home and it was nothing at all like Final Fantasy VII, I remember being like immensely disappointed at first. Like I thought I was getting some sequel or like spin-off type game from 7, and when it was this chessboard looking old medieval game. I'm like, what, did they rip me off? Is this some like illegal copy of the Final Fantasy name or something? But of course, maybe an hour or two into playing it, I realized that while it was completely different, it really was a pretty incredible game of its own merit, and kind of just let the comparisons drop and really got into what became one of my other favorite games of all time. So do you guys have any initial memories of the first time you saw it or played it? Or
Oh yeah. Oh, so I'll never forget the first time I played it. So Cam, it was actually when you got the game because at that point I did not have a PlayStation, so I would come over, and I remember at that point in our friendship, I'm pretty sure I knew the game better than I knew you, if that sounds mean, and perhaps I did come over just to play the game more than talk to you, but nonetheless, I remember just crowding in your basement, and I remember how you would of course always make your entire party of characters named according to all of our friends, and I actually think this game more than any other was what really defined our classical roles in future games going forward. I was always a caster of some sort, usually a time mage or a summoner. When we were playing, Andrew was always some type of ninja, ranger, just usually like I'm not even sure. It's like a stealthy kind of physical attack
DPS.
character. DPS. That's true. That's true. Cam was always more of a supportive person. That really came out both socially and of course in Overwatch today. But I remember just dreaming about like literally like the development of my character even when I was at home not playing the game. And I remember being angry when Cam would have battles and he would not include me in a battle, or when other people would get to go on propositions but I wouldn't. That would be extremely disturbing to me, given that I was truly the only character that mattered in his party. How about you, Andrew? What are your memories?
Actually, this is probably one of the most defining video game memories I have. I remember Cam had a sale going on in his front yard. He had Final Fantasy VII, which he's known to love, and it's his favorite game of all time. And then he had this little cruddy crappy of Final Fantasy Tactics that no one wanted to play. I got outbid for Final Fantasy VII, and I was pretty upset. And then so I went ahead and I think I got Tactics from him for about like $5 or $10.
For the record, Andrew's been broke ever since.
Yeah. I still haven't let Cam down or off of that one.
the interest on that.
But I just remember, I got this game, I took it home, popped it in, and I had to read a lot, which I friggin' hate about video games. I had to sit there and read through the intro and read about Ramza and the War of the Lions. But then after I'd say 2 or 3 battles, I got my first JP level, and was gaining JP, and that whole system kind of revolutionized these games for me. It took me into the whole RPG world, and I loved it. I played through it probably 4 or 5 times, different copies with Cam, Luke, Jared. Anyone who was interested in the game, I'm pretty sure we made a copy together and played through it.
Yeah, maybe just for reference, as is kind of we're apt to do on each episode, do you guys have any ballpark figure of probably how many times you've either started a copy or beaten the game, just for reference? I know I've beaten the game. I've actually only beaten the game twice, but I've probably had 20 to 25 copies that were like 10 plus hours over the years. But, do you guys have even a guess, just to give the listeners a sense of how much we've played the game?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, Cam, I would consider those numbers pretty weak, personally. I mean, I've beaten the game at least 9 times. 3 of those times I'd actually say included a full deep dungeon playthrough. So I like to think I understand this game far better than you ever could.
Playing through the deep dungeon, getting Beowulf and Reese. I'd probably say I've beaten the game around 5 or 6 times, and then obviously did weird copies of different character and class formations and whatnot. But
so it's a respectable number.
Yeah. I would think so. It's definitely not a short game to play through all the way, especially with trying to get Cloud and Beowulf and whatnot.
Well, the irony of Steve criticizing my playthroughs while punching his microphone won't be lost on listeners after I edit this episode. But fair enough. We'll see how that knowledge shines through during the episode. I think one of the most exciting things to me in talking about this game, and I think a perfect starting place to kind of discuss its legacy and its impact, is just how ridiculously different it was than the other Final Fantasies that came before it. And I know at the time, at least for me, and I'm pretty sure for everyone, the main point of reference we had to compare it to was Final Fantasy VII. You know, I remember we were all aware of the previous Final Fantasy games before then, seeing, I think we all saw a neighbor play Final Fantasy II, you know, Joe, Chris's Chris's cousin or uncle playing that. And, you know, we were aware of the games, that none of us had a lot of personal history with like the NES or SNES type games, but especially coming from Final Fantasy VII, it was really just insane how willing Square was to go with this game that really did every single thing Final Fantasy VII did and completely flipped the script. You know, Final Fantasy VII began to push into this pseudo modern day or even futuristic setting, whereas Tactics immediately went back to the medieval style. You know, 7 was this turn-based, pretty fast game. Tactics went back to, you know, individual chess piece type strategy-based stuff. 7 was this revolutionary 3D game where the graphics were considered some of the best ever be made at the time. Tactics was 2D sprite animations. It was no big pre-rendered cutscenes. It was just very classical, old school. So you would think all these things would be a big turnoff given all these new innovations that 7 had just made that had become so popular and so groundbreaking. But, you know, they kind of just spit in the face of all that and said, we want to make a game that's in a lot of ways back to basics and really gets back to the heart of sort of this knights and mages, sword and sorcery type medieval game. But they did it so well with such a great story and such a great gameplay system that none of those other things really even mattered to me because the game was just so damn solid and fun. So, I mean, do you remember kind of having a distinct opinion of Final Fantasy VII and then going into this game with any expectations, or were you kind of just neither here nor there about what you were expecting from it?
Like I said, you know, jumping into the game right away and just having to read a lot and, you know, seeing, you know, you play Final Fantasy VII and the groundbreaking graphics that, you know, we would just sit there and watch the cutscenes over and over again because just the graphics were mind-blowing back then. And then you kind of jump into Final Fantasy Tactics where, you know, it's like 2D puzzle pieces and, you know, it doesn't even look like a game even close to Final Fantasy VII. But then when you actually get into the storyline and the player development or like even the character development, it was actually awesome. Like you said, just a solid, fun game that, you know, the replayability was just off the charts.
Yeah, I think I did come in with some expectations from Final Fantasy VII about what the game might be, and I think the first thing that jumped out at me, even before sort of like the strategical chessboard type gameplay, actually was the character customization. That blew me away. The whole job system that really forces you to specialize, to do some things and not others, I found to be much more in depth than Final Fantasy VII offered in the way of customization, and that really was what stole my heart from the beginning, and I became accustomed and very much began to love the more strategic type of gameplay. But just the endless different combinations of like ability lines and support abilities and just team compositions really appealed to me as kind of a tactician, I suppose.
It's hard to think of a perfect sort of something perfectly equatable to 7 in Tactics in terms of a way to describe it, but I'd almost think of 7 as being like this big budget movie that really put Final Fantasy and RPGs on the map internationally, that had these epic visuals, that had this epic story with very like well-defined and sort of cliche characters in a certain sense, had a lot of romance, had a lot of like 20-year spoiler alert, but Aeris's death was like one of these big sort of cinematic moments that sort of set the bar for what we consider twists or like big game-changing moments in video games to be. Whereas Tactics was sort of this almost really deep, thoughtful indie film that had none of the trappings of what made 7 so successful, and yet it stood in its own right so well because, as they found in making later Final Fantasy games, trying to immediately one-up what you just did doesn't always work, but going a completely different route and making something that stands on its own that can't really be directly compared to the success of 7 was actually really awesome. It didn't make you want to see something that was just bigger and better. It made you, to quote Will Ferrell in Kicking and Screaming, you know, it wasn't better, but it was different. Or maybe different and better, but, you know, one of the two. But yeah, overall, it was just really, really cool that they acknowledged that just because they had put out this game that was so groundbreaking and so big and so epic didn't mean that they immediately needed to go and do something in the exact same vein, but just even more extreme. They could do something different that really indulged players in a different way, as Steve mentioned, in terms of the depth of the customization and the abilities and skills, and make something just as all-encompassing and just as fun, in a completely different way. So do you think it's maybe time to talk a little bit about what actually made, and I'll defer to you a lot, Steve, in this conversation, but talk a little bit about what made the job, skill, brave faith, just the overall gameplay and customization system of tactics, just as fun as it actually ended up being.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I loved about the game was that, so first of all, yeah, definitely the job system needs to be addressed in its own right. So, there's essentially, for those who haven't played Final Fantasy Tactics, there's a job tree. It's more or less broken down into a physical and a magical side. Magical side starts with a chemist and progresses into white mage, black mage, then the time mage, oracle, summoner, calculator, and a few other things, including even at the end a bard. Whereas the physical side actually starts with just an archer and progresses to thief, lancer, geomancer, samurai, and essentially to unlock a particular job, you need to meet prerequisites by fulfilling the requirements in earlier job classes. But you didn't want to rush through immediately to unlock simply the most powerful jobs, because you needed some other skills to bring to use while you're using a powerful job class. And so so you really had to achieve this balance. I think was actually relatively difficult to achieve between depth in, weaker to medium level job classes throughout, but also slowly progressing to a more powerful job class, which traditionally would be things like samurai, ninja, summoner. So it forced you to really think about, what types of skills and abilities do I want to bring with me into the future? What types of abilities do I want to be able to use when I am a samurai that aren't necessarily native to the samurai, for example? So I think that's kind of what really appealed to me in the job tree. What did you guys think?
For instance, teleportation, is that one of the big things that I feel like is essential to any samurai? But
I mean, teleportation was sort of a little bit an OP movement skill in that it was a little bit too useful in almost everyone. But to have a samurai with teleportation, you would have had to gone down the magic line and, sort of had to invest a lot of JP, where otherwise it wouldn't really help you that much. So it's an interesting blend.
Yeah, I think the job system was one that was a very common element of previous games in earlier RPGs in general. I know Final Fantasy V, and I think a lot of the Dragon Quest / Dragon Warrior games featured job systems. So certainly Tactics didn't introduce the job system for the first time, but what I think it did was, especially when you put combat in this isometric chessboard type layout, very strategic battle system, it allowed for far more. Your decisions impacted the battle far more than it did in traditional turn-based RPGs, because, as is the case in a lot of games, say almost any Final Fantasy where you have a 3 or 4 party member system, a lot of the times you can just get by with, physical attacking, your abilities do matter to an extent, but for the most part, there isn't that much thought that goes into most battles. Maybe boss battles, you have to really mix up what you're casting and, use a lot of items, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, a lot of the game can be beaten just by sort of bruising your way through. But in Tactics, that certainly wasn't the case. You absolutely needed a nice combination of different units that could do different things, that had abilities, equipment, and items that were set up specifically in a certain format in order to take on the battle you were facing, or just battles in general. And it really forced you to utilize every bit of customization at your disposal, not only to enjoy yourself and see more stuff, but just to actually get through the game. You couldn't simply stick with 6 squires for the entire game and expect to do well, because there was going to be battles where that wasn't really going to work out for you, where you needed range, you needed healing, you needed magic to do damage to certain types of units. It really did force you to try new things and expand, or else you had no hope of actually beating the game.
Yeah, all of that up until you get Orlando, and then
that is true.
Nothing matters.
Yeah, I mean, I know in my earliest copies, or I guess this is a better question, at what point, and maybe it's been most recently in War of the Lions type stuff, which was, the PSP re-release of the game, the remake in a certain sense, but at what point did you feel like you really started to, and this is a question for either or both of you, really start to get a full grasp of the entire complexity of the system between jobs, skills, and really, that's one thing I did want to comment on a lot, and maybe Steve, you'll be best to answer, but the Brave Faith system is something that I always understood to a sort of elementary level, but never really quite felt like I was using to its full capability. But when you factor that in on top of everything, you really do kind of add an even another level of density to the customization of the characters, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, one thing I do want to say here in reference, just the actual dynamics and mechanics of the whole battle system are incredibly complex. And I remember after probably my third playthrough, I became really curious as to why certain things work the way they do and certain things don't. And I ended up finding a resource that's since been like hailed as like the greatest resource ever for the game, called the Battle Mechanics Guide, and it was originally on Game FAQs. I'm pretty sure you can still find it there. I hate to say I forget the author's name, but much credit to whatever his name is, because it's a wonderful guide. The Brave Faith system is a good example of a system where, so talking about faith for a moment, that, it can really, you have to be careful with what you do, because in order to use magic effectively, most magic, not all, but most of it, really relies on a dynamic called faith, and essentially, the higher faith you have and the higher faith the enemy has, the more spells affect you and the enemies as both casters and receivers. Which means that when you made a caster that you want to be really strong, you would have to increase his faith to become a threat. But on the flip side, it also would make him really vulnerable to enemy casters. So it was always a double-edged sword. And there were special characters also that relied on faith and brave in different ways. The brother-sister combo you receive, they actually used inverse faith. I think one of them ignored faith entirely in their casting, and the other used inverse faith, which really flipped the scenario and is really fascinating. Brave is another dynamic where typically you want high brave actually in the game, but there are exceptions to that, and the big exception, of course, is Deep Dungeon, where in order to find some of the most powerful items in the game, you have to actually use an ability called Move Find Item. Basically, you have to explore a dark dungeon and you have to pick up the most powerful items, but you can't see where they are, and your chances of picking them up are based on 100% minus your brave. So you always want a character with low brave, which is generally otherwise isn't what you want. So there's a lot of give and take in the customization of the game. Almost everything that's a strength in some cases is a weakness in other cases, or an inconvenience in other cases. Maybe that speaks a little bit to what you were asking, Cam.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when you factor in the sheer number of jobs that are eligible for characters to change here, the sheer number of skills available to those characters, the really deep inventory system, plus everything you just explained about Brave Faith, I think to someone who hasn't played the game, it's pretty obvious just how much or how many options are available to change these characters you have. Now, I guess an important thing to mention about the game is a certain number of characters that join your party are characters that already exist in the game that are part of the storyline, that have relatively set roles that can be changed but sort of have their own either unique skills or kind of come equipped and set up a certain way. Whereas you can recruit new players that are almost in a certain sense like blank slates that you can kind of make into whatever you want. Now, they do have innate things like Brave Faith that are set a certain way, but as Steve mentioned, on almost all my copies, I would immediately just recruit a lot of these unnamed new soldiers, name them after my friends, and make them the basis of my party. But you can play the game having done very little of that, only basically using the people that join your party as part of the story, which is kind of cool because it allows you to essentially play through the game in a number of ways and really change your experience based on how you decide to go through it. Like, for instance, I know you'd played quite a number of copies where you only fought story necessity battles. You never actually fought any random battles to level your party up. You tried to make it through the game without actually doing any of that. Is that right?
Oh, that's and that was my last probably 3 playthroughs were exactly what you've just described, and the most fun I've ever had playing the game. I mean, I think the game in its own right is actually a difficult game. There are many battles that are very difficult, and if you don't know what to expect and you haven't played through it, then I would not recommend this particular type of playthrough. But for me, after I played through it multiple times, really had a sense always of what's coming, what's next. I played through the game actually forcing myself not to have a single random battle. Essentially, it minimized the amount of JP and levels my characters had at any given time, and forced me to like literally scrounge up every possible JP point, pick only the abilities I wanted, never abilities that would be luxuries, and just completely changed the dynamic of the game entirely, made everything much more difficult, but also much more rewarding, because all your choices feel that much more significant.
With that many playthroughs, Andrew, in a game this deep, is there a particular playthrough or a particular style of playing that you kind of had the most fun doing, or were each of your copies just sort of different?
A lot of times I would switch it up. My probably favorite copy was going through as Ramza as a caster. I know he's usually thought of as a knight or tanky guy who's just sitting there soaking up damage, but I had him, teleporting around battle scenes, using meteor or holy on the enemies, which was a lot of fun actually.
So, fun fact about Rams as a cast, which I actually have strong opinions about.
Highest fate.
Exactly. You can give him the highest faith in the game because he won't leave your party. And then because of that, what I used to do is keep him in his base class and then give him math skill.
Yeah.
And so that he could literally just wipe a team like that.
Well, now, you were apt to give math skill to just about every one of your characters, isn't that right, Steve?
I do have a love for mathematics in both life and in tactics.
I mean, I think that gives you an even better sense of the game. Like, for people that haven't played maybe strategy RPGs, where essentially you're moving your units in this army that you select around this map to combat enemy units, and when certain battles have certain objectives that you have to achieve, but for the most part, it's defeat all the enemy units before all your units get defeated and you win. But when you factor in everything we've mentioned so far, and then add in even more complex systems like a class that Steve mentioned called Calculator, which can use other abilities you've already acquired based on actual mathematical algorithms and calculations, you really start to get a sense of just how much thought you can put into the way you approach this game and these battles. You can go in and just try to move your units next to people, attack them with a sword and try to win, or you can legitimately plan out gear, skills, and math equations in advance to try to maximize your team's potential. And it just allows for a truly mind-blowing amount of ways to actually go through the game, none of which are right or wrong. It's just really a matter of what you think is going to work and what's fun.
So I do want to provide some more examples of that, and I know we do want to talk about the story, and I don't want to take away from that, but I think it becomes much more vivid when you actually imagine particular characters. One of my favorite combinations in the game actually is a character that's little used, so it's actually Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. You get him, if you do all the pertinent side quests, you'll get him basically near the end of the game. And you get him at level 1 when you're, of course, like level 50 plus. So most people don't use him. But he's a really interesting character to use, actually. And what I found is it just felt so appropriate to me to give him essentially all the summon abilities in addition to his own limit break abilities, give him short charge. And essentially, he can cast things at the drop of a hat. And he turns out to be a very powerful character that is both has a great range and is great sort of even within melee range, too.
It pissed me off that his last limit wasn't Omnislash, but that's neither here nor there.
I mean, apparently you haven't played Final Fantasy enough to realize that Cherry Blossom is in fact Cloud's ultimate ability, but you never unlocked it.
If I learned that in reality right now, I'd probably set this basement on fire, but that's not going to happen, I hope, so I think we're going to be okay.
Another character combination I do want to touch on that I loved was getting a ninja, actually. So you got to get move +3. Little known fact, the range of his throwing stars and throwing weapons, is exactly his movement rate. So you give him move +3, and this literally you can throw literally 9 to 10 tiles. That's insane. And then you also give him the knight's battle skill or break skill ability, which basically allows you to not only break equipment, but also break stats. And it's incredible because, so you have a guy, whenever he uses one of those abilities, he does it twice because he's got 2 swords. And you can actually just double break someone's stats like speed in 2 to 3 turns. You're making it so an enemy literally doesn't even get a turn for every 50 battle turns. It's awesome.
That or just Ramza either yelling or screaming in the corner for 20 turns, and then you just mow everybody.
Just trying to get that JP.
Yeah, as you made reference to the story, Steve, the story is something I want to talk about because I feel like it is a really complex thing that we're not going to touch on, every point of plot progression because that would be long-winded and just sort of boring. But it is a game that really deserves a lot of praise, I think, for its story because where, as I mentioned before, a lot of the Final Fantasies that came before it went for sort of these very big, bombastic, in-your-face epics. Final Fantasy Tactics is incredibly epic, but in a way that's almost more historically grounded in a certain sense and a lot more complex and intricate, where if you get lost in kind of what's going on, I can see how you wouldn't necessarily enjoy it that much. But when you start to peel the layers back and really understand sort of the characters' motivations and a lot of the themes of the game, it's actually a really kind of mature and really cool game. I know when we played it when we were younger, the big thing that stood out, I think, for all of us is Delita's role in the whole game because of how interesting a character he is, how, ruthless and how conniving, not even in a necessarily antagonistic way, but just the fact that this commoner in the game rises all the way up to become king is like sort of a very cool element of the story by itself. But the game just has so many cool things to me. The historical sort of basis of this War of the Lions that I think is based a lot on like the War of the Roses and a lot of actual real European wars of dynastic families fighting each other for control of this kingdom, and all this political intrigue of backstabbing and betrayals and, people switching sides at the drop of a hat during like this epic war. I didn't probably follow every single bit of whose side who was on and how people were related when I first started playing the game, but on my most recent playthrough, I really remember just enjoying so much all the sort of webs that were being weaved between who was, allied with who, and you got the princess who's really got no real power herself, is being used as a pawn, and almost everyone's being used as a pawn by somebody else. And then you got the religious aspect, which is common in all Final Fantasies, which is, the church on the surface is this really peaceful and really good, positive influence in the countryside, but in reality is behind all the evil that's going on. You got this main character who, on the surface, is actually not really the hero because Delita's being held as the hero, but actually Ramses might be the most heroic character in the game. I'm throwing a million things out, but there's so many elements of this game individually that I really like from a story perspective. I didn't know if you guys had favorite parts or favorite elements, or wanted to just touch on a couple that we could sort of do a round table sort of back and forth about. There's a lot to digest.
Oh, I think the story is absolutely fantastic, and I couldn't do it justice by trying to go over everything. One thing I do want to speak to that you brought up immediately, and I think was very poignant in the game, of course, is Delita's role in the game, and the internal struggle that Delita faces, and how actually philosophical it becomes as a struggle, because Delita's a character who, he's an adopted brother of Ramza, and one of his greatest struggles in the story is just the accepting or not accepting, perhaps, his place in the world. And what that ultimately means to him and does for him. And essentially what, to summarize very briefly, I think he ultimately comes to reject what was a low birthright and a relatively low place in the world when he witnesses the death of his sister. Actually, his sister, who essentially is executed as a result of many of these manipulations and machinations that he's helpless to protect. And witnessing that death, I think, really inspires in him a quest to rework his entire place in that world, and to reject everything that was given to him, and to reforge his own idea of what he is. And in the process, he ends up becoming perhaps the prime manipulator of what's going on, but that isn't always obvious to the player until much later.
Yeah, the game has a very awesome dichotomy between Ramza and Delita that I jotted down here as kind of idealism versus realism, and this idea of whether or not the ends justify the means, where in a lot of games you get these heroic characters, in a lot of cases maybe begin as idealists but turn into realists over the course of the game. But actually in this game, Ramza sort of remains an idealist throughout, whereas Delita is the one that is basically willing to do anything to achieve his goal. And while his goal is ultimately somewhat noble, because the game ends with saying that Delita became king and brought peace to the country, and it ended up being kind of, in the long run, the best thing for everybody. Really, Ramza's the one that throughout the story is still holding on to these ideals that are so important to him of, this idea of, as you mentioned, the purpose of certain classes, and the idea of class warfare and birthright. And Delita, I think, realizes very early on that the only way to really change his status and stature in the world is to basically make things happen on his own and start to climb the food chain, whereas Ramza, I think, is unwilling to stoop to some of the levels that Delita stoops to, and still aims to go about everything he does in a very honorable and a very above-the-board way, which is a really cool thing to see, because they're both sort of working towards the same end in a certain sense, but you have all these scenes of Delita betraying people and backstabbing people and, assassinating politicians to keep rising up, whereas Ramza basically at every turn is the one that is still vouching for quality and freedom and honor, and like taking on anyone who stands between him and his ideals. And it's really cool that you kind of play a character that in a certain sense seems less badass than the other character that is kind of mirroring him, but in a certain way, Ramza's almost more enviable and more cool as a character to me because of that. I didn't know if you got a similar vibe, Andrew, or...
Yeah, and I think obviously all of us, Delita was like one of the best characters of all time in any game. Just what he stood for, where he was at the beginning of the game and then where he got to, just by being himself, not buying into the class family tree bullshit that he was raised with and what Ramza kind of was strongly for. But then you get the thoughts and the feel that Ramza was kind of started to fight against him once he finds out his brothers are behind a lot of assassinations and killings of other kings. I know one thing stood out to me. It was Ramza seeing his brothers poison one of the kings, and then obviously ends up stabbing one of them. And it's just cool just having Ramza kind of realizing the world around him isn't so cut and dry. He gets to the end of the game and it's just all this conspiracy's been going on the whole time, and he's kind of slowly figuring it out. And when him and Delita find each other at the end of the game, they both took such different pathways to get there, but at the same time they're both there, and they're both there for each other, which was really cool to me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I agree also. Delita's one of my favorite characters of all time in any game, actually. And I think, not to become too philosophical again, but I do just want to add, I think one thing that really highlights Delita is his hallmark is he realized that in order to change the system that he's in, that he ultimately rejected, bloodshed was necessary.
Exactly.
That was, that was simply the necessary sacrifice. And, and so it raises the question, how much of a hero can you be if you're, the end is ultimately good, but the means is as bloody as it gets.
And so just a relatable character, I would think, in today's TV or movies is Jon Snow. I think they're completely interchangeable. If you threw one in the other's place, it's kind of scary how close they are to each other.
Just for the sake of sort of being devil's advocate, because I do think it is a game that allows for this much sort of insight and conversation. It's kind of fun to talk about the other side of the coin. I mean, would you ultimately... I guess I'll bring up one specific example and you can react to that, but just in general first, I would ask, if you had to decide who was the more heroic character between Ramza and Delita, who would you choose? And we can go into why, but just as a one-word answer.
That's it's obviously tough. If it's one word, I would say Ramza. Just what he had to deal with his family and seeing all the espionage and backstabbing literally firsthand, while Delita kind of just said, F this, I'm going to kill you if you get in my way, and I'm going to try to stop all this with my sword, pretty much.
My honest answer is Delita 100%, Ramza less than 1%.
Because I think the end of the game is meant in a lot of ways, at least to me, it always spoke to, especially the scene at the end where Delita ends up killing Princess Avilia, who throughout the game is sort of his last remaining moral compass. She's this character that you can't really tell if he's using her 100% as a pawn or if anything he's saying to her is actually genuine at all. He tells her that he really does care about certain things, and she always tells him that, she doesn't believe him. He's just using her like everyone else is, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, at the end of the game, she tries to kill him, and he actually ends up killing her in the attack. And I think that moment, to me, always spoke to the fact that he's really reflecting on how much he's accomplished, but also how much he's lost and had to do in terms of horrible things in order to get where he's gotten. And in reality, was that actually the path that he really wanted? This girl that was sort of the most innocent, sort of pseudo, lost in the confusion of the whole war type character, actually ends up being essentially, you could say self-defense, but in a certain sense, murdered simply because she wasn't willing to go along with his machinations. Whereas the game ends with Ramza sort of being lost to history because of his disappearing after the end result of the game. But the sort of epilogue of the game that mentions Delita going on and being king and being hailed as the great hero of the war, but Ramza sort of being forgotten, to me was always an even greater reminder that Ramza was really the one that was doing everything for the greater good and didn't ultimately matter to him if his name even lasted on, because his goal was the most important thing. Whereas in a certain sense, I think Delita really wanted power and really wanted to shove his rising up the ranks in people's faces, which really isn't that noble of an aim to me. I don't know.
That's an interesting analysis, and I don't disagree with all of it. I think the way I look at Delita is that I think his concrete acquisition of power was less important to him than what it represented. Than the fact that him being king, he could care less at that point, about his ability to tell anyone to do whatever he wanted. What was important was that him being king represented his ability to say fuck the system. That was, excuse me for the language, but that's ultimately what it was. Is that he wanted to rewrite the world in which he lived, a world in which he found incredibly unjust, and witnessed firsthand just how unjust it was. And everything else to that end he viewed as a necessary sacrifice. And so I see Rams's role in all of this as sort of as someone who was able to hold on to an idealism only because of the sacrifices that Delita had already made.
Well, you're also forgetting that Ramza literally saved the world from demonic destruction. So while Delita was more concerned about the actual society and his role in it, Delita was literally primarily concerned with stopping this giant religious conspiracy that threatened to literally destroy everything. So while one achieved a very worldly end, which did signal a large social revolution that was no doubt great, the irony is that beneath it all there was literally demons trying to take over the entirety of Ivalice that most people were never aware of, that Ramza literally died or didn't die. I think the game leaves it pretty open-ended whether or not he's actually dead. I guess you see him at the end, but it's unclear if it's actually him or just sort of like someone seeing a vision or running through the graveyard. I think it is. But yeah, I just always... this is an aspect I love of the game. I think Delita is a great character because he starts out, in my opinion, being the more heroic of the two and ends up being someone subservient or someone who's not quite up to par with Ramza, in my opinion. But because we're even able to have this discussion, I think shows how awesomely complex the plot of this game is. And this is like without even getting into the motivations of about like 20 other relatively chief characters in the game. Maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about, since we're a long ways along here already, is either some favorite just moments of the game that we haven't touched on already, some favorite characters that you encounter, some favorite combinations of, there's just so many individual memories I have personally, I'm sure you guys have as well, that I feel like instead of breaking it down into specifics, just anything that you want to elucidate about playthroughs, whether it be favorite combinations of jump on a chemist or favorite side characters that are really memorable. I have quite a few myself, but I'll let you guys mention some first.
Yeah, I'll keep it sweet because I think we rambled on for a little bit there. Short and sweet, sorry. But
it's always sweet.
It's always sweet, yeah. I guess favorite character combinations or just probably one of my favorite parts of the game is just Orlando, and you fight this random battle of about 10 monks. I forget what the map is called.
I think it's Grog Hill.
Grog Hill, yeah, exactly. And you you have Orlando, he's got Excalibur, so he always goes first, and you have these just lined up monks just waiting to get slaughtered. You go first, you go as far as you can forward, and you just lightning stab about 5 of them, and they all die. I know it's kind of cheap, and Orlando's a cheap character in my book, but that battle is just hilarious.
So my probably 3 favorite battles, I suppose I can't talk about all of them, but I love almost all the boss battles. Almost all of them. I mean, they're just so good. And I think Ryvane's Castle against Weirgraf probably tops the list, where Ramza actually has to fight Weirgraf solo until Weirgraf actually transforms into a giant goat-ass demon and summons demons who cast Dark Holy while he's casting Cyclops at you. And it's an insane and literally scary battle. It's also hard as hell. I mean, your first time at Ryvane's Castle, you're probably going to die your first 4 tries. And they also set it up, of course, so that if you accidentally saved over your copy after the first series of battles in Ryvane's Castle, then you're stuck. So you got to find a way through, and that actually made it all the better. Another battle I loved was the battle against Elmdor, and his 2 assassins, Celia and Lead, which is also a hard battle, and it's even harder for a few reasons. A, it's one of the only opportunities that you can learn the ability Ultima on Ramza, and B, in the original game, you had the ability to steal a lot of their armor, which was incredibly rare. And if you tried to do all of that, unless you prepared immensely, you would just get slaughtered. I mean, literally, Elmdor.
They had a one-touch kill.
Exactly. There's these demonic assassins who literally kill you in one hit, can stop you from a distance. Elmdor himself can turn you into a vampire, can use pretty much every samurai ability out there, especially Muramasa, which just properly placed can slaughter a team. It was just an awesomely difficult battle all around.
Yeah, no, I refuse to believe that anyone ever beat that Weird Graph battle on the first try without any knowledge of it coming, just because I don't know how you would... The best class and item and ability combinations to take him on are things that you really have to plan in advance for a little bit. I'm sure you could beat him just being a certain level or with some crazy combination of like moves, really complex moves, but for the most part, the easiest way to take him on is certain combinations of class and skill that really put the battle in your advantage. But without knowing that boss battle's coming in advance on your first playthrough, I have no idea how anyone would
you'd beat that.
had realistically beat that. I remember having the exact same experience and being incredibly frustrated upon doing that, but also how rewarding it was to finally beat him. But yeah, the Elmdor stuff was awesome. It always pissed me off, and this is something I think is corrected in War of the Lions, so I'm looking forward to eventually playing that. But just some of the translations of the attack names, like it always pissed me off that the assassin's stop bracelet killed you instead of stopping you. Yeah. And like it just seemed like all these weird moves that you would think would do one thing did something else, and then just the fact that they could one hit kill you in general was annoying as hell. But the fact that it also, some of the translations of just the attacks made no sense also made me increasingly mad. There was that earlier Elmdor battle where you have to protect some... It might actually be Rafa, I can't remember. You have to protect someone on the rooftop, yeah, from dying, and she moves in like an idiot and is in range of like Shadow Stitch and Stop Bracelet within like 2 turns, so you never actually get time to do anything you want without her dying.
There's no way there's anyone in history that actually built up Ramza enough to survive more than one hit from like the assassins.
Yeah, it's completely ridiculous. So I mean, I think I'm trying to think of another one you mentioned earlier on that I absolutely agree about is I don't know what her name is in War of the Lions, but I think it's Tita in the original game. Is her death when she gets shot by Algus at the end of the first chapter is definitely a really awesome moment because it completely changes the course of what's going on in the game in terms of splintering Delita off from Ramza and really setting up the rest of the story, but also just showing you just how damn ruthless the people involved in all these sort of machinations were in terms of, he was literally willing to basically shoot a relatively young girl in the face with a crossbow and then blow everyone up in order to just basically maintain this level of supremacy over the lower class. And his disdain for commoners was such that he literally approached killing Delita and her like they were slaughtering animals or something.
There is one more battle that comes to mind, and the name of the exact place escapes me, but it's the battle where Ramza tries to unlock a gate for your party, but while he's on the other side of the gate, he's ambushed by Gafgarian, and essentially Ramza has to fight Gafgarian alone while the rest of your party is surrounded by like knights and summoners and shit. And it's pretty cool. It's pretty damn cool.
I think that maybe it's not. I was going to say Lionel Castle, but I think that might be earlier. But I remember the exact fight because that's one where Gafgarian's kind of an annoying enough character that you almost like take pleasure in crushing him. So like setting up Ramza in a certain way to really massacre him was always funnier on like following playthroughs. Like either immediately stealing Gafgarian's weapons so he couldn't really do like jack crap against you and then just murdering him, or giving Ramza the ability to jump so he could basically get over the wall or get up on top of the wall real quick and get out of half the range of Gafgarian's
Even
attack.
better, just give him teleport, as you should be giving every character in the game. But and then lastly, one more battle, and I promise I'll stop after this because there's so many good ones. But is also the battle against Gafgarian at the execution site, where you think that you walk in expecting that Ramza's sister is about to be executed, and what you find actually is that they literally like pull off like a cloak and like a mask or whatever of what was supposed to be Alma, and it turns out to be an archer, and Gafgarian's the actual executioner who is ready to like crush you.
I remember that's one of the only times in the game you can get a blood sword. I think you can poach it and stuff otherwise, but I remember always stealing that from him. Yeah, I'm trying to think of... There really are just so many, and I know one that Andrew and I used to talk about all the time also. I know we're getting into a bunch of moments here, but there are so many good ones, is all the Izlude stuff where it really just shows you once again how effed up the characters' motivations are in the game, that the guy Vormov, who's ultimately like arguably the primary antagonist of the entire game, basically just is willing to murder his son and a bunch of other people with this demonic gemstone thing because he's so far gone and so involved with these demonic entities that he basically just massacres his own people, which it always creeped me out so much in the game how instead of showing the violence, it would just cut to a black screen and play that like screaming noise, just leaving you to imagine whatever happened while the screen went black. But
my favorite animation, also somewhat similar, is actually the Dark Holy animation. I don't know if you guys remember that animation and sound effect, but it's literally just like dead silence, like, and then like the sound of like a cut, and then like.
Yeah, that sounds disturbing. It still haunts me.
You see like dark soul pods like rushing through someone. It's insane.
I mean, it was, even as much as it wasn't the technical wonder that Final Fantasy VII was, the design of the game was great. Like, the attack animations, the whole aesthetic of the game, it really worked. It wasn't as technologically impressive, but so many of, the sword attacks, the summons, the spells, locations you fought out, the music, all just really top-notch. So it wasn't really inferior, it was just different, which is A-okay by me, because 7 was always going to be a hard game to kind of one-up. But, we're sitting at about an hour now. We've really even barely scratched the surface of some of the absolute levels of depth that we could go into talking about the game. But before we actually wrap up, is there anything else you kind of want to... I think maybe a good thing would be to sort of just maybe quickly, individually, maybe summarize why we'd recommend the game to listeners, or who we think would be best suited to play the game, who might want to based on their other interests.
Yeah, I've already put my cards on the table, but incredible replayability. Extraordinary story, wonderful balance between RPG elements and strategy gameplay, truly charming environments, sound effects, animations. Fantastic.
Yeah, the same thing along those lines. Great story, amazing story. Me and Cameron have always talked about, if they ever made a movie of it, it'd be an outstanding movie. And then as far as, replayability, obviously the music was great. The sound effects were awesome. There's few better feelings than crush punching someone with the Lita and automatically killing them. Yeah. So, like I said, as far as like people who would probably enjoy playing this, I don't know, there's aspects of MMO in there. There's aspects of, obviously your classical RPGs. But anyone who's really, it's like a playable book. It's
got a pretty wide demographic. I think.
It's an outstanding story, and I think I'm not a big reader, but I think it's like playing a book. It's an outstanding cutscenes, especially the remakes.
Yeah, I would definitely say don't let the style of the actual battles turn you off. I know some people I showed the game to saw them, like our friend Tyler, and I think immediately I had showed him 7 and he liked 7 so much, and I showed him this and he immediately just said, "This looks dumb." I'm like, this looks too much like a board game. I'm like, I understand why you would think that, but really the battle system on the surface, or like if you want to play it really casually, it really isn't that hard to comprehend. Like, you can put so much more thought into it and really take it to another level, but really just getting into the gist and ebb and flow of the battle isn't as intimidating as it might look. So if you've never played a tactical or strategy game before, don't let that be the reason you don't play this game, because it's absolutely worth a play regardless of whether or not that is your thing. But I think you'll learn very quickly that is actually one of the strengths of the game. So yeah, fantastic game overall. Not enough can really be said about it, but it's not like we're the first people to really rave about this game. It's certainly a cult classic, and one that I'm always kind of interested to see, even since that many more Final Fantasies have come out. This is still one that a lot of people hold in really high regard. That usually when people ask what your favorite Final Fantasy game is on Reddit, for instance, someone will always come in and say, like, are you talking about the numbered series or Tactics? Because if you're counting Tactics, it might be Tactics for me, which I always kind of fist pump to, because I'm glad the game gets the type of reviews and I guess is revered as it really deserves to be. But as we usually wrap up the episodes, we've gotten away from the shout-outs because we've shouted out so much to so many people that I really feel like we've kind of touched base with the people we want to right now. The support's still been fantastic, but we don't want to go on at the end of each episode about the same people over and over. So, Steve, you want to maybe just drop our social media stuff real quick, and then we can do a little quick wrap-up?
Sure. Just a quick reminder. You can get in touch with us or find out more about us at the following places. We have our website at http://thelimitbreakers.fm. libsyn.com. Our email is thelimitbreakerspod@gmail.com. Our Facebook is facebook.com/thelimitbreakerspod. And our Twitter is twitter.com/limitbreakerspod.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, not to begrudge anyone at all with the shout-outs. I didn't mean to imply that we didn't appreciate the people that have helped us, just that we know we've repeated some of the names so many times at the end of each episode. We don't want to belabor that. But I do want to thank Andrew very sincerely, because not only has he been on a couple episodes now, but I feel like, as I mentioned before, it's impossible for me to separate sort of my memories with these things from a discussion of them. So it's pretty essential to have the people that I've experienced these games with so many times here discussing it, because they are more than games in a certain sense. You know, breaking them down just in terms of the mechanics and the story is one thing, but then you factor in specific memories and what we were doing, what we were thinking when we were playing it, and that adds a whole other level of just funny, interesting, or iconic moments, at least in my mind. So I appreciate you doing this one. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. Love what you're doing. Keep it up.
Appreciate it. So I guess that's episode 8. Episode 8, yeah, I don't want to incorrectly state it. Episode 8 of the Limit Breakers podcast, Final Fantasy Tactics episode. I think our goal is to get another episode out relatively soon after this one, but I'll post an update about that either way on our social media. Guys, thanks as always for listening. For Steve and I, and for our guest Andrew today, this has been the Limit Breakers podcast. Thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.